Hi, and welcome back to CPG and Food Day here at Global Supply Chain Week. My name is Kevin Hill, Executive Publisher here at FreightWaves. And in our next fireside chat, we're going to talk about refrigerated containers with Greg Tuthill from SeaCube Containers. Thanks for joining us today, Greg.
Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Hey, can you give us a little bit of background on SeaCube and yourself as well?
Sure. I'll start with CCube. CCube's been around for almost 28 years, and we're one of the largest container lessors in the industry. Specifically, we focus on reefer containers. We also do dry containers, gensets, and equipment financing as well. In terms of my own background, I have over 30 years in the shipping industry. I've held various positions in operations, trade management, sales, and pricing. And now I am the Chief Commercial Officer for SeaCube Container Leasing.
Very good. So the last 12 months, I mean, even, I think we all might get tired of asking about how COVID has affected different industries, but it's one thing that we can't get past, right? Because it really has had the most and most powerful impact of anything else. And so my first question is, how has COVID impacted the business for leasing and moving refrigerated containers?
All right, let me back up, and I'll take you back to March of 2020, and that's when the pandemic really started to affect us here in the United States, but also around the globe. And we were very, very concerned first quarter of 2020 about the impact of COVID, the challenges, and the economic impact overall that would impact the container leasing industry. Surprisingly, and we're certainly happy to report that quickly after April, the demand for container leasing was very, very strong with a catch-up program that took place on the side of the carrier. So if you would ask me to forecast the outcome of 2020 last March, I would have probably been 180 degrees off of where we ended up. With that being said, as you probably know and everyone else knows, the outcome was very, very favorable, not only for container leasing, but for also the container shipping operators.
When we think about refrigerated containers, and international shipping, what are some of the most popular commodities that you move or industries move with refrigerated containers?
Bananas are one of the top commodities, but cherries, grapes, avocados, frozen fish. There's a lot of fish farming that's taking place around the globe now, and that seems to be a common trend. Protein is another large commodity that is also on the top of the trend line as well.
Yeah, so it's much different than the commercial demand versus consumer demand. I'm going to still analogy that Kyle Littner over at K Ratio uses all the time is that the trucking and logistics for walking into a nice steak restaurant, ordering a couple steaks and a couple beers is much different than the supply chain and the demand for going in and spending the same amount of money in a grocery store. So there's a lot more goods. There's a lot more buying power. You can buy 20 or buy 5 or 10 steaks, maybe. It depends on what kind of steakhouse you go to, right? Which increases the volumes of goods that are moving. Is that something that you guys at SeaCube felt over the last few months?
Certainly, there was a shift during the pandemic, and over the last few months, of course, we saw a shift because of the services industries. Specifically the restaurant, the entertainment, the cruise ship business, that all does impact perishables and commodity movements based on demand cycles. So, but the shift actually was offset in terms of volume by the higher demand for what we consider the retail consumer perishables. So, all in all, the demand held up very, very well. In fact, the reefer trade market has been probably the most resilient out of any of the trade groups in terms of being consistent, and the demand cycles seem to be continuing in that fashion.
Yeah, you see that on the domestic side too. The refrigerated outbound tender rejection levels nationally have been well north of 40%. So almost two out of every five loads tendered have been rejected by domestic carriers, trucking companies here. And it's kind of that same narrative, right? Is that the consumer demand instead of commercial, it went from commercial demand to consumer demand, which means really more freight. And we've seen that both domestically, and we've seen it, as you just said, on the international side too, coming over.
Yeah, and specifically, right after the pandemic started to unfold, of course, that retail sector on the consumer household perishable side of the business really grew exponentially, and that was because, generally speaking, there seemed to be a run on food in most locations, and the large grocery chain retailers, big box retailers, they could not keep enough frozen and perishable commodities in stock, and I think we all experienced that when we went to our local grocery store. So that demand, and that was, a lot of it was because of that big push for uh, commodities tied to the commercial, not the commercial side, but to the retail side, really was the big push.
It was, yeah, and you can see that in a number of different industries, but the grocery side is certainly the most prominent of those. On the perishable side, has there been any disruptions in the normal flow of goods internationally? Or customers and shippers, are they trying to rework where they procure some of their product because of disruptions in their supply chain?
I would not say there's been a lot of alternative sourcing. I think for the most part, the sourcing has probably remained the same. I think the most important area that is of concern is the congestion, logistics challenges, and the throughput constraints that we're experiencing. So I think there's been alternative routings that have been certainly explored and also executed by some of the major shippers. So I think that's certainly on the forefront of everyone's mind right now to make sure that there's not any delays, or at least they're trying to mitigate delays. So I think that is certainly something that's been a priority as of late. So I think that will continue until things probably clear up a bit.
Yeah, let's talk about port congestion because it is the top headline news right now. We've been publishing quite a few articles on it on FreightWaves.com, and they're our best performers. It's like all eyes are, especially on the West Coast, Port of Long Beach, Port of LA, looking at. We have some video up looking at the traffic jam and the congestion out there on the ports. How does that affect the refrigerated container shippers out there?
Yeah, certainly the congestion and some of the issues related to logistics and just trying to look at the conveyance of reefer containers and perishables has been a real concern. But there's been alternative services that have recently been launched to go ahead and offset some of that, and some of the major lines have considered that. I was just on a webinar the other day with Northwest Seaport Alliance, so there's certainly some alternative gateways being explored with additional plug capacity for reefers. So I think at this point, I think there are some alternatives being certainly used, and I think trade routes will probably continue to be fluid, just to go ahead and offset some of the challenges that the shippers are facing.
When you say trade routes are going to become fluid, is that maybe routing to different ports, maybe on the East Coast, Houston, maybe different ports than the West Coast?
I think so. I think it all depends on commodities and transit times and demand cycles too. So some of the commodities and some of the demand for perishables may not be or may not lend to longer transit East Coast routing, but I would say that certainly any alternative that would be something that would offset some of the risk where there is major port congestion will be considered.
How about, we all always talk about the West Coast ports and the Asia trade. What about Europe and Latin America? Are we seeing the same kind of congestions and buildup and disruptions in those areas as well? Or is that something that's, unique to the West Coast?
Some regions are worse than others. I would say that certainly in Europe, I know that the UK has had significant problems, and other ports in Europe as well. And a lot of this is due to the outcome of COVID relative to labor supply, available capacity because of labor supply. So, it all kind of comes back to the impact of COVID, the infection rates, and not having consistency across the supply chains with even capacity flows through the supply chain. So, of course, that will get better as we continue through the year with vaccinations taking place. But that has been significant in certain regions. But some regions, again, have been probably hit a little bit harder than others.
Yeah, I would imagine the UK is probably feeling a lot of pain right now with Brexit and COVID. You have a lot of things going on in UK and Europe that are natural disruptors, right?
True. Yeah. And that's been a real challenge and an obstacle or an impediment for a lot of the shippers that, have significant volume through those, uh, those areas.
Yeah, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about non-COVID items and patterns of demand and supply. What are some other factors out there or trends that are going into the future that that are affecting consumer and customer demand that you're seeing when it comes to refrigerated containers and what commodities are loaded and how they're shipped?
There's several different factors that are, I would consider, key catalysts to the ongoing growth of reefer trade. Um, one is just the population growth. So with the pressure on sourcing commodities outside local communities, there's going to continue to be that trend. I will give you one example. I think seafood is one area that's going to continue to have more outsourcing because of the farming that's taken place and the organic fish stocks that have been under pressure. So I think that's one area. The other key catalyst, and I think most people are aware, is I think all of us are looking toward a healthier diet, which is requiring healthier foods, which is also requiring year-round supply of such commodities that normally would be seasonal. So therefore, I think sourcing alternatives are starting to expand beyond just local communities and going outside of that traditional sourcing format. So that would be another one. I think the other piece here that is probably not that large in terms of volume, but it will have probably some impact on the reefer trade is the pharma industry. So the pharma industry has looked at refrigerated container vaccine storage, last mile transport, and a lot of this may not be happening right now because air freight is the key mode for vaccine transport. But as we get further along, emerging markets that don't have the infrastructure and maybe don't have the access to either temperature controlled facilities may use containers for refrigerated containers for vaccine storage, overflow storage, or last mile delivery. So that could be another area that would be an opportunity for a lot of participants in this trade.
Yeah, I think air freight right now is cheaper than ocean freight on the dry goods side. So I imagine the spread between the two air and maritime is probably a little bit even wider when you're talking about refrigerated containers or air freight.
True. Yeah. The urgency right now is obviously distribution of the vaccine, and that is actually taking the priority, and therefore air freight and that mode is the priority for getting vaccines to the right place at an expedited time frame. But eventually, I think there will be a place and maybe an application for ISO refrigerated container vaccine storage. And as you know, and most others, I think there's going to be vaccine temperature controlled requirements that will lend to maybe a more typical refrigerated container than super freezer containers as well.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right on that point. On your other point in the question before, we're talking about organic versus, say farmed or should we say commercially produced or highly efficiently commercially produced food and perishables. How different are those two supply chains, right? So organic is more specialty niche, kind of normally lower volumes and it's just a different supply chain, right, between commercially produced perishables and foods and farmed things like seafood and organic. How's that going to change the change that really the corporate supply chains going forward, and how those products are sourced and transported?
The specialty products, I think, will continue to go ahead and grow, and I think that trend is already showing that there's a very upward trajectory of more and more demand for organic type products. And again, that ties back to, I think, just the general public being more conscientious of healthier diets, and whether that's a plant-based diet or whether that's tied to healthier diets. I think in terms of the stratification between a traditional produced commodity that was more of the commercial type segment versus organic, I think we're starting to see a shift there where there's going to be more organic. I don't think the commercial side will ever go away. I think there's always going to be mass produced products on the perishable side that will continue. But I do think there'll be a lot of growth in specialty perishable type commodity segments as we go forward.
And I guess there's going to be a lot of efficiency gains in how those organic, those smaller companies, those organic perishables are both procured and moved, into the U.S., right?
Yeah, and I think that also is tied back to containerization. So containerization continues to be the number one mode of transport for organic products. One is because it's efficient. The other piece of that is because technology advancements have been so significant that it's allowed us to obviously continue with longer transits with controlled atmosphere and also better outcomes. So I think waste has been mitigated or minimized, and I think that we can go ahead and outsource to other areas that 10 years ago would maybe be not so viable.
hmm let's dive into technology a little bit. That it's increasing efficiencies and eliminating waste in refrigerated containers and shipping of those. What are some of the best technologies out there, or the biggest improvements that you've seen that you're most excited about, Greg?
Well, one is, and I just mentioned this, is the controlled atmosphere technology has.
Yeah, what exactly is that
So, and
for
that,
those of us who
yeah,
aren't familiar with it? Yeah.
yeah, and that is controlling the the environment inside the container between what would normally be oxygen levels or CO2 levels, and that basically slows down the ripening process for certain fruits and vegetables, and also preserves the commodity for longer periods of time. So uh, that particular technology advancement, used to be much different, and now we have passive and active type controlled atmosphere technology that has allowed for people to ship product for a lot longer, with now extending to longer transits, and again with much better outcomes in terms of what happens on the other side when that gets to either the shelf or the table. So I think that has been probably the number one improvement. But of course, there's also telematics, which is basically tracking, tracing, early warning diagnostics for the interior of the container to make sure that the product is at the right temperature, has the right humidity, has the right airflow. So I think all of those things have proven to be certainly a major shift in allowing us to do more at longer distances, and that's really a big, big breakthrough.
So Greg, what is your prognosis for 2021 for the rest of the year? What do you see happening in in international shipping?
Well, on the refrigerated container side, I'll start with an outlook on that, and that is we see the year being still very, very favorable in terms of the growth and the demand, and also that particular segment of the trade will continue to probably be very, very favorable in terms of it standing up all the way through the end of the year. In shipping in general, I think also will probably be a positive outcome just because of the stimulus and also some of the other things that are attributing to the economy being held up and basically being favorable as well.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, for joining us today and sharing your knowledge about refrigerated containers and the market going forward into 2021. How does our audience reach out and learn more about SeaCube and contact you directly, Greg?
Yep. The audience can go ahead and look at CCubeContainers.com, and they can go on our website, and that has information about our product services and also how to contact us. In addition, if there's any questions, I'll be happy to receive emails. My email is gtuthill@ccubecontainers.com, and I'm happy to go ahead and answer any questions or provide any additional information related to today's discussion.
Thank you very much again, Greg. Greg Tuthill, Chief Commercial Officer at SeaCube Containers. Stay tuned for our next fireside chat.
Yeah. Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate the opportunity to participate today.